I told you about it. We're joined in studio by Okraku Mantey, who is Deputy Minister, Tourism, Arts and Culture. And I'm sure for many of you, you knew him as owner of, Slip Entertainment, Slip Music.
Yeah.
At the time, producing lots of Highlife, musicians. He's also been a judge on reality shows. I didn't like his comments then. I'm sure they would like it today. Good morning, Okraku Mantey.
Good morning. Winston.
Thank you very much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you join us. Let's now also go online on the phone. We're joined by Professor John Collins, ethnomusicologist and professor of music at the University of Ghana. Professor John Collins, good morning and thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Great, and I know that you've written extensively about Highlife music. In fact, your house is like a museum of Highlife music. So, Professor John Collins, tell us, what is Highlife music and how did it even come about?
That's like asking an American, what is jazz and how did jazz come about? It's a huge question.
Sure.
But basically, it's a homegrown Ghanaian music. It's got some roots in Liberia, Sierra Leone, but largely Ghana, that emerged in the early 1900s in different contexts. It's a popular music, what we call fusion music. It's not traditional African music. It's a combination of traditional African music with Western elements, like harmonies, instruments, and influences coming in from the Black Americas. In the case of Ghana, for instance, a very important input coming into early forms of Highlife was the West Indian soldiers stationed at Cape Coast and Elmina castles during the Ashanti Wars. So it was like a melting pot. And then various names emerged, like Adaha, Sibi Saba, and then finally the word Highlife was invented in the 1920s. So it's a complicated history, and it doesn't have a single source. It comes from different areas, and different ethnic groups contributed to Highlife. It's not just Akan, but also the Gas, and to some extent the Eves as well, southern Ghanaians. And then, of course, it spread into Nigeria in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So that Highlife also took off in Nigeria as well from then.
Okay.
So that's to give you a real history is very difficult, but that's basically Highlife is to Ghana what jazz is to America, or Trinidad is to what the calypso is to Trinidad, or
okay.
Samba is to Brazil. It's a sort of national music. It's become a national music in Ghana. And I believe next year UNESCO will elevate it to the status of an intangible cultural heritage. But it does have extensions going into Highlife from other neighboring West African countries. And of course, it spread from Ghana into other West African countries.
We'll look at the spread into other West African countries, but you've also talked about influences from Liberia and Sierra Leone. Can you explain these influences? Can you explain the palm wine music, the brass band music, and the dance music, the influences all these have on Highlife?
Yeah, there was a lot of migration going on. During the colonial period, people were moving from country to country. Africans, that is. So the case of the Liberian, the crews, the Liberians and the Sierra Leone, they were black sailors working on sailing ships and later steamships in the 19th century who Africanized or began the Africanization of the guitar and introduced African techniques into guitar playing, which they brought to many West African countries, including Ghana. So, for instance, I used to know very well Kwame, whose uncle is Kwame Asari, who's the godfather, really, of the palm wine music. It wasn't called palm wine music, by the way. It was called Sibi Saba, or Osibi Saba, and later became called Highlife. So that was a type of Fanti music. It was born in the Fanti land. But there was this input coming in from the Liberian crew sailors who taught the guitar to the Kwame Asari and others, and then they Ghanaianized it and got the Yam Ponce, the Odonson, and so on styles. So that's the one input. But the brass bands is a completely different origin of Highlife. It wasn't called Highlife either in its early days, called Adaha. And that was because of the African soldiers in the colonial army switching from playing Western music, Western military music, to African music or African rhythms. And the trigger for this was the West Indian soldiers who were playing Afro-Caribbean music. So, for instance, songs like All For You, Everybody Likes Saturday Night, that in Ghana we see as sort of classic old-time highlights, were in fact West Indian melodies, which were copied and then adapted by the Ghanaians. But I'm not saying that the West Indians are the source of highlife, but they were an important trigger. Because, back in those days, the colonial mentality, brainwashing and so on by the whites was very strong. So it would be very difficult for African soldiers trained in the British Army to play African music. There would have been a taboo against it, or, it would have been forbidden. The whites weren't teaching African soldiers to play African songs. But when the West Indians came, playing Afro-Caribbean, they were halfway African anyway. So this was the trigger that convinced some of the African soldiers to say, okay, well, we can copy Afro-Caribbean music. Why don't we go the whole way and also develop our own music? So they integrated traditional rhythms into the Adaha. You might ask me, how do I know all this? I was very lucky that a friend of my father was called Professor Atana Mensah, and he did research in Cape Coast in the 1960s. He was the only academic who ever did research in Cape Coast into highlife music in those early days. And luckily, he got this whole story about the impact of the West Indians on early forms of, at least the brass band highlife. So this is, as I say, the story is quite complicated because there's no single origin of highlife. It's not a single ethnic group, it's not a single location, and it's not a single genre. It's quite complicated. But let's say that we can put highlife back to about, under various names, to about 1900, 1890. So highlife is a pretty old form of music now. It's as old as jazz, just as old as jazz.
Okay. But Professor Collins, before I come to Mark Okraku Mantey in studio, for many young ones, for many of us, we hear lots of rhythms and sometimes you are confused. What's really the highlife in here? So we hear songs that we probably may think, oh, this sounds like a reggae song or probably dancehall, but then we're told, oh, this is a highlife song. So what's that rhythm? What would let you know that this is a highlife song?
Well, there's several rhythms that are typical of highlife. One is the ka, 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 which we now call jammer. Then there's we have another one that came from Sichi style, ka, 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 ka. Yeah, the triple offbeat. Then we have the Adawa type of rhythms in 6/8 times and so on. But the problem with, you see, when I met this rhythm, the typical highlight, or one of the typical highlight rhythms, when I was young, I heard this rhythm, pa, 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 which everybody now, and we were calling it highlife. That's what we were calling it here in Ghana. But you see, when the hip life generation came, they wanted to get rid of all the old music and all the names associated with highlife. So when they invented hip life, the beats were not originally African at all. They were funk, hip hop, to rap. There were a few exceptions, but basically they were rapping in Twi or Ga over American hip hop beats. But then there was the revolution that occurred with Hush Hush Studio, Jeff Q, Jammer Hip Life. And the youth brought back highlife into hip life, but they didn't want to call it highlife because highlife was Kolo, it's old fashioned. So they called it Jammer. So the youth, if you talk to the youth today, one of the typical highlife rhythms that we knew, say 40, 50 years ago in Ghana, they will call it Jammer. They won't call it highlife. So there's that confusion that some of the what we would call highlife has been renamed by every generation. Would often take something and rename it, put something old in a new bottle. Okay. But it's the same thing. In fact, if you read my book Highlife Time, I have a chapter called The Highlife Imagination, and because highlife has been in Ghana for more than 100 years, it's gone into the genetic codes, the genetic memory of Ghanaians. So it keeps on coming out. So even if you listen to Afrobeats in Nigeria, there's a lot of Highlife in it, because Highlife also moved to Nigeria. So sometimes the youth will put old wine in new bottles. If you follow what I'm saying. So,
okay.
But there are certain distinctive rhythms associated with Highlife in Ghana traditionally, at least about 3 or 4, if not more.
Okay, but I mean the bit about Jama and Hash, some actually argue that by 1997, Keep Your Eyes on the Road, Reggie Rockstone, he had used Alaji K. Frimpong. So
yes,
then you saw a departure.
Yes,
you saw a departure
that's why
from
I said
the
there
hip-hop.
were exceptions. Basically, Reggie Rockstone, and I think also Lord Kenya brought out a song which had an Afrobeat, fella style Afrobeat. So a few of them did use local rhythms, local songs. But basically, the bulk of the hip-lifers, the early hip-lifers, just rapped over hip-hop beats. The word for hip-hop, the original name for hip-hop in America wasn't hip-hop. It was actually electro-funk. Funk music played on electric gadgets. So there was a lot of this gadget, electro-funk music being played by the youth. So they rapped. So the first thing that happened with hip-life is the Ghanaian youth indigenized the language, not the rhythm so much. The rhythmic indigenization in hip-life came in the mid-70s, when was it? About 2000, with Hush Hush Studio, with the Jammer Hip-Life. So Jammer Hip-Life is really Highlife's hip-life. It's a hip-life with a Highlife type of beat. And then this, in turn, one ingredient was missing. The language had been Ghanaianized. With Jammer Hip-Life, the rhythms had been Ghanaianized, but no dance, no specific dance for hip-life. So they invented the Azonto dance. And the Azonto dance was actually the first local electronic dance music, and it predates Afrobeats. There was a time when Azonto was quite popular in London, and the Nigerians were claiming they invented it and so on. Yeah. But about 2 years later, the word Afrobeats was invented for this type of electronic dance music being created in different West African countries. So hip life is very interesting because it moves from the African Ghanaianization of hip life, that is American hip hop rather, the language first, then the rhythms, then the dance. And so by the time you get to a Zonto stage, hip life had been thoroughly Ghanaianized, and at the same time, hip life gave the youth of that generation the knowledge of how to use electronic technology for music making. This was a great gift. So then after the hip life, we get many hip lifers, or ex-hip lifers, that generation, going back into high life, contemporary high life. Kidi and Kofi Kanata and all of these guys are the generation who went through hip life, got the training in modern technology in music, and then gravitated into back to high life, but not the old high life, but the recycled high life. The same is happening in Nigeria. There's a band, they came to visit me last year, these guys. They're called, I think they're called the Cavemen from eastern Nigeria. They're doing the same thing with Kofi Kinata and Bisakidi and so on. They're taking the old type high life and putting it through, remixing it as an electronic mix. But it's still basically high life. So It's different from hip life or Niger rap.
Okay.
So high life has never died. And every time, look, people have been telling me that high life is going to die. They've been telling me 40 years, 30 years, high life's good. It never dies because it's in the imagination. It will come out in a different form. Youth will give it a different name. But now they're even calling it contemporary high life. So it's never died. It's part of the genetic memory, musical memory of Ghanaians, and for that matter, Nigerians.
Please hold on, Professor Collins. We'll come back to you shortly. We have Mark Okraku Mantey, who's Deputy Minister, Tourism, Arts and Culture. But of course, for many of us, we know him because he is an executive music producer. He's been there. He's produced lots of music. And I've been talking to Mark. Thank you very much for joining us once again. But for you, what's high life to you?
I think Prof has said it all. It is difficult to define high life because of how it started. And because of how over time other instruments or other cultures have influenced high life, and they've all been accepted as high life. This morning, one person I was going to mention, we've heard his past this morning. Our own Jodako.
Yeah.
Yes. Just yesterday, when your producer called me, Sammy, and I was telling him that we need to have a thorough, deep documentary on our industries, because gradually, all the people, very soon, you will struggle to get some of the information you are getting today.
Yeah.
And Jodako is one of the people who played a strong role in the evolution of high life. And where is he now? This morning we should be talking to Jodako. He actually brought the funk into high life. That was funk.
Yeah.
When they lived in Germany at the time, it was funk. And as people, Lido do, Sometime, Jaga, all of them, they didn't have jobs to do. And Big Joe was around. Say, oh, let's try and produce something. The idea that came was that. And so they produced Equity Brofo. And after that time, Equity Brofo gave birth to the Charles Samuels.
Yes. Boga
High Life people, yes. Charles Samuel, Daddy Lumba, all of them. Even Mr. Music Man Kujonchu will tell you, oh, he doesn't do. But we remember Kujonchu, Hinimio, Ampuno, Hinimio.
That's the one he actually would say, oh, this, that kind of high. That he admits.
He was also influenced, all of them. Before we also came, we were all influenced by that Jodakun route.
You came with a contemporary one.
You
called it contemporary.
We did hip hop highlight sort of. And then to add to what Prof said, Prof, before JQ came, Zab Mallet, I remember that time myself, I was the one who influenced that particular recording. Achiame Brababa Hima. It actually starts with Adwa.
Okay.
So
yes,
we were the ones who actually brought the Fie guitar into hip hop.
Yeah.
It was before JQ cry. So it was Zab Mallet who introduced that kind of guitar into hip hop in Ghana. At the time, people were just playing the rhythm without guitars. We said no, our identity is a guitar, so we need to have that. So you see, I'm not in a position to define high life because I was one of the people who also changed what. So some people said my kind of high life was not high life. When I also came,
Yeah.
At the time, it was also not a normal sound for high life. But if that time we said it was high life, at the same me, after some time I came back with correct. And I called that one to high life. On the same album, there's a song called I Saw on it. It was difficult at the time. I remember Ghana Music Awards one of the meetings I had to walk out because there was a confusion between myself and Fredima because he didn't believe that Ashikele was High Life. And I said it was High Life. I produced it and I'm saying it's High Life. He says no, it's not.
But the fact that you produce doesn't mean it's
correct. But in when I was doing it, I had a vision with George Ara. I knew what I wanted to do. And I wanted to do High Life. But today, there are a lot of songs. When Azonto came, Azonto's root is Ashikele. So it is difficult, like Prof said, to define high life because almost every rhythm of high life of Ghana, traditional rhythms, have found their way into the mainstream or contemporary music that we do. Abena, you know that song?
Yeah.
I produced that one too.
Nana Kwame.
Yeah. It's Adwa. Full Adwa. Zab Mallet played some fine live bass on it and Obrafo came on it. Pure Adwa. But it's our life. Matthew. Adani Best. If you listen to the Adwa, Abena and Adani Best Matthew, they don't sound alike. But both are high life.
Matthew's Balogo.
Correct. But we all said that one was high life.
Yeah.
Coming back to modern, is it Down Flat? Kevin Boy.
Yes.
Pure high life. He just didn't put in the guitar. But the timing that Prof was mentioning isn't there. It's in there. You can play it, you hear. But I'm sure if you talk to Kevin Boy today, he'll tell you, me, I don't do high life. As for me, I do Afrobeat. So it makes it very difficult. Even our own Kwame Eugene.
He's supposed to be the king of high life,
Yes.
isn't it?
But today, if you listen to Kwame Eugene, it is difficult to tell if he's still on that track.
Maybe we can just get Professor John Collins' take on this one, whether he also believes there's high life. But Prof. Collins, I'm sure you may have you listened to Down Flat, the song that we just played. Would you say this is high life?
Well, the rhythm is high, what we used to call high life. Maybe a young person will call it a jammer beat. The funny thing about that particular beat, the clips, ba, 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 it's now become universal in the world. I mean, they of course, they play it in many African countries, but you find that beat now in the samba, Afro-Cuban music, and so on. So this is one of the reasons why Afrobeats has become so big in the world, because you could say the world has already been primed to African music through jazz, reggae, samba, and so on. And so over the years, over this more than a century, so that some of the rhythms now are found on both sides of the Atlantic, and that particular rhythm is probably the most important rhythm in the world at the moment. Dance rhythm.
Okay. Yes. Let me get back to you, Mark. So this is, and all of you agree, both of you agree, this is high life. But the young man says he does Afrobeats. Afrobeats.
And not to forget to touch on what Prof said. That cleave sound. Okay. There's another one that we play in the German one. Quack, 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 quack. Mayway was the one who made that snare pattern. Quack, 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 quack. We used to play it with a cowbell. The one who made that pattern very popular in the world was Nas. Look for that song. You Can Hate Me Now. You can hate me now. He used it for hip hop. So although it is from here, just like Prof said, that it's become universal. So, but when you hear it, you will think that it is hip hop, but he actually got it from this side of the world.
Okay. We still have Professor John Collins, ethnomusicologist and professor of music, and Mark Okraku Mantey, who is a music producer. Yes, that one we still would call him a music producer, but he's also the Deputy Minister of Tourism, Arts and Culture. But Mark, you used to organize the Highlife Festival.
Yes.
And Nathaniel Atos sent me that message that I should remind you of the Highlife Festival and why you must bring it back. We'll talk about that later on.
Because he was the MC for Highlife Festival.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Good. There's interest everywhere.
Yes.
But you have to bring it back anyway.
Yes, we will.
You have to bring it back. But why? So, we're talking about this genre that, as we can see, is with us. It's like it's a part of us. But today, they say Afrobeats. Even Afrobeats, we knew of Afrobeats. Now there's an S to it. That's a subject for another day. But the younger ones, the new generation, talks all the time about other things. Afrofusion, Afropop. Why are people running away from high life?
It's a positioning issue. Showbiz is driven by dexterity, is driven by images, flex. And so if or somebody say swag, if a brand does not appeal to the young ones as sexy enough or attractive enough, they will tap into it, all right, but they want to, as young as we also were, and we also wanted something new, because the orientation or the motive for Kokoko was that the old men didn't want to accept our hip life. When I did Kokoko, I was about if 25 years, it means I was 25 years when I recorded Kokoko.
Okay.
Yes. So you could tell the energy and the vibe. Because I wanted strong kick, strong snare, so that we could compete with the party songs on the dance floor. Because I was a nightclub DJ at the time.
Sure.
So I was influenced by. Did you say A? Okay.
No, he doesn't know.
One day, give me 2 turntables. Yes.
Aaron doesn't know
Okay.
that part.
Yes. Aaron doesn't know that I started the music play in this building. Joy
He
FM.
doesn't know.
Oh, okay. I started in 1999, test transmission, Joy FM. At the time, it was Asempa's studio. That was Joy FM. This place used to be where we used to eat. We used to eat local joints, this place. I remember Komla Dumo's joint was this particular room. Yeah, so that's another day when you call me. I'll come and tell you. Yes,
come.
when you're celebrating your. Yes. So, when the positioning is not good, and I'll use one typical example that will make it very short. When Fred Darko, our own Fred Darko, decided to manage Amachiride, at the time, Amachiride's value wasn't that high. He had ran, if I want to use the product life cycle, he was declining. And Fred Darko went into Amachiride's life and said he wanted to manage Amachiride and changed the image of Amachi by how he dressed. He did one big show for him on the 24th of December. Did some giant billboards in town. Gave Amachi some image as if it wasn't the same Amachiride. The same year, Joy FM had also given Amachiride Night with the Stars. And he, I think when he performed, they used said they didn't want to hear anybody again. They just wanted Amachiride. The same year, Shalifo Manson did, is it Picture Perfect?
Perfect picture.
Or Perfect Picture?
Perfect picture.
Yes. I hear there's another one called Picture Perfect. A foreign one or something.
Okay, yes, it's perfect picture.
Yeah. That's why I'm getting confused. So, Perfect Picture. Remember, Shirley told the story about Amachiride. How Ajit Anand,
Yes.
he ended up, Ajit Anand was a rich man who loved Amachiride. So the movie ended with tan, 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 tan. That is some selling, some marketing soft position of a brand that Shirley did for Amachi. So that year, putting these things together, Amachi's events at the conference center, organized by Fred Darko and his team, gave Amachi a new image. President Kufuor was there.
Yeah.
All the big boys in town were there to see Amachi today. President Kufuor danced to Sufre Wunyame na Omwao. I remember when Queen Elizabeth went to buy the CD of Queen in the UK. It's a British group called Queen.
Yeah.
It was an old album. The Queen of England decided to go and purchase the Queen's album. That old album. That week, the album shot to #1. So if President Kufuor attends Amachi this event on the 24th December or something, a new image is made. After that, Amachi this value changed. Price changed. So positioning is everything in business. When the younger ones were growing, you see A.B. Krenso on stage with Fugu. A.B. Krenso dresses similar to Pastor Otabel. There's a problem. If you're selling a brand and the young ones, when they go to church, the performer looks like their pastor, they will not get attracted to the brand. So they will take elements of the same genre, but they will not be happy mentioning that that's what they do. Because every young person doesn't want to be called an old person. So if the brand does not look young, if it's not positioned to fit the young ones, and that is why Reggie Rockstone's Hip Life penetrated the market, because Reggie Rockstone, keep your eyes on the road, the man was not even in shirt. He only had some knapsack bag,
Yeah.
and some khaki trousers with his dreadlocks. For a younger person, that's what he wants to see. That's what he wants to hear. So Highlife must be repositioned. And that is why when I was doing my Highlife festival, I never chose any of the traditional Highlife joints. I took it to Alisa Hotel. So it attracted some kind of people. So I remember when Joy FM partnered me and I said Dr. Pabo was performing that particular weekend. They said no, they didn't want Dr. Pabo. This thing we have to, Joy FM people in your English. You have to go and speak plenty English to Ichikwam. So Ichikwam said, look, believe in the man. He's done something nice. That's why you want to partner him. So far, this Highlife thing is going well. Work with his choice. So Pabo was on. You won't believe when Pabobo performed the Osoboche.
That's Samuel Dami's wedding song.
Oh, sir. Mr. Chum came and said, is it the man who performed the song?
Yes.
So you see, because Chum likes the song, but he cannot associate with the personality. Because of how they positioned the brand, the way they looked whenever they appeared at places and all of that. So Pabobo, after that Alisa one, the next night to the stars, Pabobo was on. Meanwhile, when I said we wanted to do Pabobo, Joy FM said no. But the Joy FM, same Joy FM night to the stars subsequently.
Okay.
So it's brand positioning.
Let me bring in Professor John Collins. Professor Collins, so, I mean, we've all talked about Highlife. We talked about the influences and how it's influenced even other genres. But today, people would prefer to say they do anything apart from Highlife. Why?
Well, I think the Deputy Minister was on the right path. What he was saying, it's the youth. The biggest factor for social change in any society is the youth. They will recycle the culture. And often they want to, they will take, obviously the culture that they're recycling, they've inherited it from their ancestors, from their peers, parents, grandparents, but they want to put it into a different bottle. And often, for instance, if we went back to the 1920s, I'm sure that there were some people complaining bitterly, oh, why have they changed the name CB Saba, which is the old fancy name for Highlife, to Highlife? I'm sure there was a controversy about this, but sometimes it doesn't really matter about the name. Today we call Highlife beats Jammer beats, or with the youth gave that name. It wasn't the old name for Highlife. So I think it's a natural process. The same thing happened in Nigeria with Afrobeats. When they came up with the word Afrobeats in 2012, and by the way, it was a Ghanaian called, I think it was called Abrantier Boateng, a DJ, who came up with the name Afrobeats, not fella type music. So I was in Nigeria at the time. I was giving a talk at Celebration on fella and Bob Marley and so on. And there was this big dispute. This would be in 2013 in Lagos, between the older generation, which I belong to, who knew fella, and we liked his Afrobeats, and the young ones who were calling it Afrobeats. And the older people were very, very annoyed with the youth for confusing the name. So they asked me to arbitrate in this. It took place at Victoria Island, this meeting with the youth and the old elders, me coming in as an elder. But I actually supported the youth. I mean, I said that the youth have the right to rename things, because language changes. Language itself changes. Culture itself is always changing, and the great change, the dynamo of change is always the youth. So sometimes they will reject old names, but they've inherited the old tradition, so they rebottle it in a new form. It's a natural process that goes on. So sometimes maybe the word highlight may not be popular anymore, but highlight is still with Ghanaians, if I can put it that way. It will never go because it's deep in the memory, the musical memory of people. So it's a natural process. So Afrobeats today, there is this confusion between the old Afrobeats. So one way the youth, look, there's a very interesting story about hip life. Hip life started with people like Reggie Roxton, etc. But after a while, the hip life generation decided to honor Blay Ambule for his funky highlights of the 1970s. Now, when he was doing Semigwadu and so on, those types of fancy raps, but the word rap wasn't then used. So you could say that the youth then brought this ancestral figure to them, a highlight musician from the 70s, and said he was the godfather of hip life. And of course it gave Ambule a new lease of life, because he wasn't really that at all. He was doing his own thing, a funky type of highlight. And the same thing happened with Afrobeats. A lot of the older generation in Nigeria got annoyed that fella's music was getting mixed up with the Afrobeats, the dance music of today. But in fact now, if you look at any movies or videos of Afrobeats, whether Nigerian or Ghanaian, you always see a picture of fella. He's been reabsorbed by the youth. but not given the same name. That's what the youth do. It's been going on for maybe tens of thousands of years. The young people coming and renaming old things, and old people getting annoyed. That's all I can say.
Okay. So I mean, finally, Professor Collins, before you leave, if I get you right, whether it's Highlife or not, the rhythm would speak. I mean, whether they choose to call it Highlife or not, the rhythm would speak.
Yes, it's. I mean, I would even say that Highlife itself was based on older rhythms that come from traditional African music, and it's like a language. These things stay with the people, but they gradually change. The language changes, the culture changes, the music changes, and the people who always do this are the youth. The youth come up with a new name, a new bottle, but they're taking the old material from traditional music or popular music, highlight music, and so on, and they're putting it into new bottles to make it more palatable. As the minister was saying, the deputy minister was saying, the youth are looking for a new sound. I mean, if you take Amachi Dedi, for instance, I mean, one of the things that Amachi Dedi did to reinvigorate his brand of Highlife was he put a lot of reggae beats in. His drummer, at one point, was really playing reggae. You could even class his music as sort of Highlife reggae at one point, even though it was sung in Twi. So people are looking for novelty, especially the youth. And if you don't produce the novelty, they will say you're colo. Old-fashioned. That's what they say.
Great. But before you go, Professor Collins, because you talked about being in Nigeria and having to settle a debate between the young and old, I also know that you had to settle another debate about even the origin of Highlife in Nigeria.
Yes, that's right. When I first went to Nigeria back in the 70s, when I was working with people like Fela, every Nigerian musician knew where Highlife came from. Whether I did meet many of the early pioneers in Nigeria back in the 70s, Zeal Onya and people like this, and Victor Owaitu. Everybody knew where Highlife came from, but the youth forgot. So I was invited, I think, about 10 years ago to Port Harcourt, and there was a meeting, because that's where Rex Lawson came from. But, Rex Lawson himself was influenced by E.T. Mensah. But there was this debate going on about whether, in fact, Highlife was actually invented by Nigerians. And there was a confusion because the British BBC had brought out a program on Highlife in which it started in Nigeria. They were completely wrong. So I went to sort of correct it. And then I was a Nigerian professor called Professor Tunde Vidal. He brought out the first reference to Highlife in Nigeria, which was a newspaper cutting from 1938 in Lagos. And guess what it was? It was the Cape Coast Sugar Babies.
Yeah.
So, and then I brought out documents going back to the 1920s showing the word Highlife in Ghana was being used 10 years, 15 years before that. So we know that the word itself came from Ghana. And it was the dance band variety, the ballroom and dance band variety that became very popular in Nigeria with E.T. Mensah and the Cape Coast Sugar Babies even earlier. So I don't think that dispute has ever been resolved with the youth. The youth, because Nigeria has had Highlife for about 80 years. I wrote a book in Nigeria called Highlife Giants, in which I look at the interaction between Ghana and Nigeria over the last 80 years in terms of Highlife. Going from Ghana, then to Nigeria, back to Ghana, to Nigeria. It was going backwards and forwards. We even had Nigerian bands in Ghana in the 1950s, like the Delta Dandies and others. I don't know. They're like big brother, small brother. They're sort of borrowing from each other. But when all is said and done, what we know as Highlife today was crystallized in Ghana and then went to Nigeria. But it's been there for so long that, as I said, there's a Nigerian professor, Austin Emeelu, who says there's about 20 distinct varieties of Highlife in Nigeria, tribalized or ethnicized types of Highlife. That's why, so the youth had forgotten. The youth will forget, and they will try to reinvent everything. But what they're doing actually is they still will go back, Sankofa, to the old, and renew it, recycle it, but they will give it a different name. And that's their prerogative because they are the new generation. We're the old generation.
Okay.
The youth
Professor John Collins, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're grateful you made time to join us. Professor John Collins is a Ghanaian ethnomusicologist and professor of music at the University of Ghana. Okraku Mantey, so what do we do now?
The pop culture is taking over the world, especially through technology. If you do not protect what you have, people, it's become like the air or water. It's difficult to control because you don't know what your child is watching or your brother is watching. And so these are some of the things we need to watch as a government. Instead of just thinking that, by concentrating on Ghana and you do not look at the peripheral, before you see somebody is using phone, boosting something on YouTube or Facebook, every minute they are showing something to your child. But you are thinking that, traditional TV or radio is what is controlling your culture. It is not. And so that is why now you see that Amapiano, where did he come from? South Africa.
Yeah.
After our Shikele, nobody really followed the rhythm. Then somehow World Cup came 2010.
Mm-hmm.
Then we went for World Cup. And then when 5-5 came back with Bujebaya,
Yeah.
you see culture. They just went for World Cup and they came back and we started playing ton, 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 ton. At that time it wasn't Amapiano in South Africa, it was Kwaito. We started playing Kwaito in Ghana. You see how Amapiano has entered. But it's difficult to say that you will not accept Amapiano. Why? Because for a government representative, I've gone to sign for African Continental Free Trade Area. And so if we've decided that we want to trade amongst ourselves, boundaries are being cleaned, then somehow it is even good to have these cross rhythms across Africa. If it is going to give us, as Africa, some good money, why not? It is also our job, if we want to preserve her life, to take the right steps to preserve her life. Kwame Eugene has signed to Empire. Empire will definitely influence this kind of music. Just like when Lucky Dube signed to Sony in South Africa. His style changed. Anytime you sign to a new label, the label will influence because they know their target market. And so it's a 50-50 thing. We want to make our money. You also need your money. We want to expand global market. That's how you must sound so you can make money. The artists will often accept. So if you listen to Kwame Eugene's music now, he is not the typical Kwame Eugene you knew.
Yeah.
Correct.
Everything about him has changed now.
Correct.
Even his voice has changed.
So, yes, that's how it works.
Yeah.
That's how it works. So, our record labels must get support so that they can also produce more of what we want to hear as Highlife. I've always said that we can't hear our Highlife the way CK Man, the way Nanam Pedu, the way Jodakon, all of them. Even CK Man. DJ, get me Asafube son. Even CK Man. His Highlife was fusion.
Yes, he had a lot of influences in there.
Correct. So if you say you like CK
And
Man,
Latin rhythms and
so
all
you
of
want
that.
us to stay there. Even CK Man wasn't the typical palm wine Highlife. At the time there was a popular song, Bustin' Loose.
Mm-hmm.
CK Man used it. Asafube son is Bustin' Loose.
It seems our time is up.
Okay.
So we'd have to end on the Asafube Son bit.